Awesome. Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Elisa Kirchhofer. I'm Marketing Director with Idioma Education and Consulting. Thank you so much for joining us and Maureen Lamb tonight. Maureen is one of our instructors. She's also a Latin teacher, and I'll let her introduce all of her titles when she introduces herself, teaching at the Ethel Walker School in Connecticut. And tonight she's going to share some of the new 2024 guidelines updates from ACTFL, which I know we're all super excited about, because what does that mean and how is that going to impact us in the classroom and with our standards and everything. So Maureen, why don't you go ahead and get started?
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining everyone on this hot and humid Thursday night in Connecticut anyway. My name's Maureen Lamb. As Elisa said, I am the Dean of Faculty, the Dean of Academic Technology and Innovative Pedagogy, and the Latin teacher at the Ethel Walker School in Simsbury, Connecticut. And I've had the absolute pleasure of working with Idioma Education and Consulting for many years now, and it's a lot of fun. I was very excited to do something on the new ACTFL 2024 standards. I'm excited by how accessible they are, but also it's a 56-page document. So maybe it's better to have someone summarize it for you. I enjoyed what the languages used, but I'm also going to tell you some of the things I grabbed from it, and I'm happy to field questions afterwards. If you want to follow along with the slide deck, feel free. The slide deck link is tinyurl.com/2024 ACTFL standards. Or if you prefer QR codes, we've got that lovely little QR code in the corner. And just in case you come in late or you missed it the first time, I'm going to share everything at the end one more time. And this is not proprietary except for ACTFL, so don't don't share the you can share the ACTFL stuff, but credit ACTFL. But I would say that if you want to share this, as long as you keep Idioma, you can share that part. Okay. So there was a great interview by Meg Malone right after this whole thing went down, and it was awesome. Meg Malone works for ACTFL, and she was one of the key people in getting these standards made. And I really loved what she had to say to Michelle Ola in her episode of Language Lounge podcast. And she said, "You are not an intermediate speaker. You are speaking at an intermediate level of proficiency." And I love that, because I think that so often it's easy for our students to label themselves. And it's hard when you give yourself a label to see yourself along the continuum of proficiency. So I think it's really nice that she said, you are not advanced or superior. You are a human being. And this is where you are, and this is where you're going. And I think that that's something that's really important about these new standards. I see them as more accessible. The language is much more accessible and easy to understand. I also think that the charts are wonderful for visual learners. I happen to be a visual learner, so charts are my jam. I also think that the explanations are really clear. So I think that's something that's a real advantage about these 2024 guidelines. It's all about accessibility. When ACTFL was going into these guidelines and going to rewrite them, they wanted to use language that was accessible for all teachers and was also language that non-language teachers understood. I think sometimes we get into the trap of using language ease and talking shop. And so it's wonderful to have accessible language that we all can understand, but our boss can understand, our superintendent can understand. And I think that's really, really important here. So that's something that was also great about this. Question. Oh, the URL link for the new standards or the URL link for the slide deck?
Hi, I was asking about the slide deck. I couldn't find it in the URL link.
Oh, no. Okay. Yeah. Elisa, could you share the URL, please? Thank you so much. There you go.
What was it? tinyurl.com/ Okay. Thanks, Maureen.
Of course. Also, this is something I really like about these standards. I know this one's a little harder to see, so it can be a bit of an eye test. I just got bifocals, so I can see it, but so I'm not going to use small font for the rest of it, I promise. But they have this wonderful protocol called FACT. And so they split up what you can do with a language into functions and tasks, accuracy, context and content, and the text type, which I think is wonderful because we're all language teachers or we're language teaching adjacent, and we know that there's so much to learning a language that's more than just memorizing grammar charts and so much more than just being able to recite a list of these special verbs. Rather, language is nuanced, language is different in different situations, and language changes over time. Your language abilities also change the context in which you can use a language. You may have comfort using it in a classroom at first, but hopefully over time, your comfort will expand to different contexts and even unfamiliar contexts as time goes on. So that's something that's really important to take into consideration. And so first, I really liked how each of the levels were described. Novice is all about simple. I also love that they took the word memorization out of novice. I know that novice descriptions for a long time have said memorized phrases. And I think what we hear sometimes when we hear memorized phrases is we hear memorize for the test. And that's not what we're looking to do. We are looking to have students acquire language. And so it's been changed to rote, meaning something that's repeated over and over again, rather than something that's memorized. And I think that that's a lot more indicative of second language acquisition theory here. I think that's really important to have that repetition in the classroom, not in a way that's not compelling, but just making sure our students get a number of repetitions as they go through things, especially at that novice level when they're first starting to acquire language. Because we know it's a lot about getting that input so that they can eventually do output. So especially at that novice level, really centering the idea that students are getting this input and in the simple ways at first, but we all know students can understand usually to a higher level than they can actually produce. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. I know I just gave my Latin ones their final today. And one of the cool things is that they can read at such a high level. They are basically novice high, intermediate low by the end of Latin 1, which is so cool. But they're novice low at other things. They're novice mid. They don't novice low at speaking, certainly, but even novice mid at writing. And so they are at different levels. And it doesn't mean they're novice mid children. That's just where they are on their level of proficiency. It's kind of the idea of not yet. You're not there yet, but you're working on it. And we're going to talk about how they redefine those, because novice low used to always sound like, oh, you're low. And that doesn't feel good. You don't want to be low. But the way they redefined low, mid, and high really makes more sense. And as a learner, it actually feels better. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Next, we have intermediate. And so here we're moving on to simple sentences, simple constructions, simple conversations. Usually at the intermediate level, you have students who have a much better grasp of vocabulary because they've already acquired all of that vocabulary from their novice levels. And so by the time they get to the intermediate level, there may be some stumbling blocks in terms of more complicated things to deal with, but in general, they can do some communicating, some simple communicating back and forth, and maybe even a little outside their comfort zone. Then when you get to advanced, you have students who have become more confident in their skills. They are more confident in writing. They are more confident in reading. They are more confident in speaking. And they have reached a level at which they can interact in a lot of different situations and in a lot of different contexts that are unfamiliar, and still have those skills with them that they've acquired that they can then apply to a new situation. I know these are things that we all knew, and I'm sure these are things we're already teaching, but it was just so refreshing to have it laid out like this. I think that's something that's really good. Especially think about if you're brand new to language teaching and someone tells you novice, intermediate, and advanced. You're going to think, okay, not really sure where each of these falls. Like, what is a novice? A novice is what level, what skills can a novice learner do? And I think that the great thing about the 2024 standards is that it outlines this fairly clearly. And I think this is a great system to use. Okay, I'm going to move on to the different levels within each of these. I am purposefully not going into distinguished and superior, because although I know we have amazing students, I think that most of our programs are probably focused on novice, intermediate, and advanced, but there's also resources for those other two levels if you're looking for that, or if you're at a higher level. That's something to consider. So rather than thinking that I'm at novice low, the idea is that not that you're at the lowest tier of a language, but rather you're approaching expectations for that novice level. And I really like this kind of tweak of mindset because it shows more of a growth mindset. So if you're novice low at something, it doesn't mean you're not good or something. It means you are approaching, you are getting there. And maybe you're making mistakes and maybe you have some things to work on, but you're still on the continuum of proficiency. You're still on the journey, which is really cool. And then if you are mid, you are meeting the expectations for that level. So if you are intermediate mid, you are meeting those expectations for intermediate. You have hit all the marks. Maybe you make an occasional mistake, but really on the whole, you're meeting where expectations ought to be for this particular level. Then advanced or high, not advanced, I used the wrong word, sorry. Novice high means not only are you meeting novice expectations, you are meeting and exceeding them. And in some cases, perhaps you're even demonstrating intermediate low to mid work. And so the idea of a novice high isn't that it's separate from things that are intermediate. It means you're starting to blend the skills of novice and intermediate together. Again, I love this because it really demonstrates very well that journey of proficiency, that journey that takes you from a novice level learner and helps you along that path. And I like the idea. I know a lot of us in our schools are using rubrics like these for different things. Having students meet expectations on a certain skill is really important. And so if we rethink the levels as low being someone who's approaching expectations, mid being someone who's meeting that criteria for the expectations, and high meaning you're starting to exceed expectations by blending in some of the skills that you can do for the next level, that's great. Does that make sense? Okay. I'm getting some nodding heads, so that's good. People are listening. Fantastic. Next, we're going to talk about the modes of communication. They are still the modes of communication we all know and love. Our interpretive, our interpersonal, and our presentational. It's just reframed in a way that I think makes a lot more sense. So let's take a look at how these are reframed. And I told you I'd get rid of all that pesky small text because I like pictures. Who doesn't? And so when we're thinking about interpretive tasks, usually we're thinking about interpretive reading, interpretive listening, and interpretive watching, right? But there's also a lot of different things within that. So you have these interpretive things that students are doing, this reading, this listening, and watching, but there's so many different ways that they can demonstrate that. And I think that one of the things that the ACTFL 2024 standards does well is giving you suggestions about what this might be. So students might do an interpretive task and then like do a survey or do a checklist for what they notice. Or maybe they'll do a deeper dive or investigation. Maybe they'll make cartoons to demonstrate their learning. Maybe they'll have a conversation and ask questions back and forth. Or maybe they'll write about it. These are all interpretive tasks, but we don't know where students are in terms of their proficiency until they can like do something to demonstrate it. And so that's important to note. And it's also good that there's a bunch of different examples in there. These are a little more examples than they actually have in there, but it's important to note that there's just not one way to do an interpretive task. You don't have to do reading and comprehension questions all the time for every interpretive task. There are a lot more out there that you can play around with. And I think that's really nice to hear, actually. Also, you'll notice that I have a blue arrow there on the bottom. An interpretive task is a one-way task. This is how it's described. I don't know how much I love the one-way task, but I understand it's less of a back and forth, because I think the real feedback for a student for an interpretive task is between the student and the teacher, because the teacher will hopefully give feedback to the student after they perform the interpretive task to let them know how they're doing, to let them know where they're at on their journey. But it's considered one way because you don't necessarily get feedback from a greater audience. You don't necessarily get like immediate feedback. This is something that you're working on, that you're not necessarily getting that kind of right away contemporaneous feedback back and forth like you might with an interpersonal task. So that's why it's called a one-way task. Does that make sense? So the one-way arrow, student puts it out. Hopefully they're still getting feedback from their teacher, but they're putting it out into the world with no expectations that this is something that's going to be shared with the greater community necessarily. That doesn't mean you don't have your students drop cartoons to interpret a text and put them up on the wall. That's awesome. That's great. You should absolutely do that. But it does mean that, you know, they're not necessarily going to be doing it for a wider audience. Whoops. Okay. Next, we have the interpersonal tasks. Now, these are the interpersonal tasks we know and love, but interpersonal, again, by its very nature, is two-way. And something that was pointed out by Meg Malone and has also been pointed out by a bunch of people online, which I completely agree with, is the world has changed since 2012. The world has changed drastically. Back when these standards were made in 2012, the focus of interpersonal was interpersonal speaking and listening. Now, at this point in time, our students are communicating quite often by texting back and forth. So the idea that communication is something where it can only be contemporaneous if you're going back and forth with speaking and listening, that's not what's going on here. A lot of people are texting back and forth. And so that is another way that you can engage in the target language and get that back and forth. And so that was one of the reasons they wanted to update the standards, is because there's this brand new, well, not so brand new, but this form of communication that is so dominant, especially among our students, and get them doing it back and forth in the target language. It is so much fun using things like discussion boards. We use Canvas at my school, and the students can go back and forth in the target language, doing a discussion, comment on each other's discussions. It's really fun. And they like to talk to each other anyway. Or Canvas has this brilliant thing where you can do videos of each other back and forth. So you can have like a little video message. Of course, you need to monitor that, but it's really fun. Finally, we have presentational. Again, presentational tasks have not changed. They are still presentational, but we have presentational speaking, and something that's a little different than 2012 is that we now have a lot of, online webinars and stuff like that. So this is an example of presentational speaking, me speaking to you. And that's something that, again, the world was a little bit different in 2012. It certainly existed, but it wasn't something that happened all the time. And now it's something that happens all the time. Also, podcasts weren't as big. And now students love podcasts, or at least my students love podcasts. So there's a lot of different ways you can do presentational tasks that may not have been as accessible in 2012 that's now part of our reality. And so I think it's really important to think about, okay, when you're thinking about a presentational task, it doesn't mean that a kid needs to sit up in front of a room. It means they can make a video, they can do a podcast, they can do a webinar. There's a lot of different options for them. I also, with my students, and this is something the standards doesn't address, but it's something I think is important, is whenever I'm doing presentational tasks with the students, I make sure they have some feedback before they go into the presentational task. Because the idea behind a presentational task is this is something that is polished. This is something that a student has hopefully been working on for a while. This isn't something where they're going to get up and wing it or throw it together last minute. This is something that they spent quite a bit of time on. So again, there's not this contemporaneous interaction. So it's technically a one-way interaction of communication, but hopefully students have gotten a little feedback from their teacher beforehand so they know what their expectations are. Another great thing for a presentational task is to model or give choice, because some students are super comfortable getting up there in front of a room and giving a speech. Other students may do much better if they're alone in their bedroom making a video of their speech, because it helps them to focus, it helps them to do it. So there are options you can use for presentational too. And also presentational writing, which I didn't address here, but that's something that students are doing all the time in many classes. Writing lab reports, writing analytical papers, even for more advanced classes, writing analytical papers in the target language would be a presentational task that a student is hopefully getting feedback on throughout the process. Okay, so this is really interesting. Proficiency. Now, proficiency is the way someone, and I'm going to get this wrong if I don't read it, but proficiency is basically the way you interact with the world in unknown contexts. So maybe you meet a person and you start talking to them in the target language. That's your proficiency. Like, I am at this proficiency because I can do this. If you can pick up something you've never seen before and read it, that's a certain level, that's your proficiency level. If you get a phone call that's at a certain level, then or you're listening to something that's at a certain level and that's what you comprehend, that is your proficiency level. So proficiency is something that isn't necessarily wedded to one context. It can be in any context. So that's really interesting. So proficiency is how you interact with this in unknown unknown quantities. And whereas when we're talking about performance, these are known quantities. So you know that you're reading this book and you're going to be answering questions about it. You know that you've listened to this something or other podcast, and then you're going to be writing about it in the target language. You know your teacher has said this, and this is something you've gone over in class, and then you're going to do this with it. So performance is something that is not, it's not a surprise. Proficiency is, this can be applied to any unknown context. The performance is always a known context. So I really appreciate the definitions of the two of those like that. So proficiency, encountering anything, that's where you're at. Performance is something that you are familiar with the context, you're familiar with what you're going to do. And you can see that as you move forward in proficiency, you get more and more confident and comfortable, hopefully, in those unknown situations. Okay, any questions on that? That was the part that I really had to kind of wrap my brain around a couple times. Okay. Now this is taken directly from the text there. Again, I love charts. So it's like, ooh, I'm all about this. Love these charts. So again, performance. So for example, if you're doing that presentational task, it should be something that is rehearsed. So when you have kids doing a presentational speech, again, they shouldn't be winging it. This should be something that is rehearsed, is practiced. Maybe they've done something very similar in the past. And this is their demonstrated performance of things that they've done. This is something either that they've done before or very similar. Proficiency, on the other hand, is something that regardless of what their level is, this is them encountering something new and unrehearsed. So that's the big difference between the two. I hope that's helpful. Does that make a little bit of sense? Okay, we're going to dive into this a little deeper. And we're going to talk about those facts that we talked about. This is just an overview. So again, here's some of the changes part of the overview is specific references for each domain. That's kind of what we just went over, just the specific references to things. And then specific references to the 7 parameters that we were talking about before, those facts, functions, content and context, text type, language control, vocabulary, communication strategies, and cultural awareness. And then also thinking about speaking and listening, reading and writing. And that's what we're going to spend the vast majority of the last part on. And so this is what I really liked. I really liked the definition and the kind of understanding for each of the tasks. So for functions and tasks, you're basically answering the question, what can you do with the language? What can you do with it? What is something functional you can do with the language? So for speaking, for someone who's completely novice, you might be able to say, my name is, you might be able to say, I like, I dislike, yes, no. You're not going to have a lot of ability to communicate until they've acquired more language. They will probably move pretty quickly along the continuum as long as they have acquired a lot of language, but still, at the very beginning, they're not going to have that much. Then, as soon as intermediate comes around for speaking function, they can do pretty much sentences, simple sentences back and forth. They can probably produce sentences at a level, but again, nothing is advanced. Advanced students should be able to have conversations in the target language in some unknown environments or unknown contexts. So outside of the classroom, they should be able to be engaging in the target language. That doesn't mean that people can't at the novice and the intermediate level. They just might not have the comfort yet that someone at that advanced level might have. So that's the idea of functions and tasks. When we're thinking about accuracy when it comes to speaking, we are thinking about, are they understanding grammar and syntax? Are they understanding vocabulary? Are they reacting appropriately to who they're talking to? Like you would talk very differently, perhaps, to different people depending on the situation. You're not going to order a coffee from your teacher necessarily. Maybe you would, I don't know. But you're going to talk about different things and interact in different ways with different people. And you're also going to think about, when you're thinking about accuracy, you're thinking about that cultural context. What is the context of the language? And when is it appropriate to use different contextual language? So it's really interesting because I really like that within accuracy, we're talking about intercultural competency. We're talking about an awareness of how students are using the language and what's behind the language. So it's not just about reproducing the language flawlessly, but it's about how do I interact in this particular situation? What is culturally appropriate? How can I be intercultural here? And so I really appreciate that about accuracy. Then we're thinking about content and context. This is connected a bit to that intercultural competency. I think it's in both. We have the idea of content and context is it's going to be very different if you're sitting there having a lesson in the classroom than if you're on a phone call with someone. That's going to be a different kind of speaking than if you're meeting someone for coffee and talking in the target language. And I was thinking specifically of some fun Latin copies I've had with people. So talking in Latin, but you're going to do, that's a different context than you might do in the classroom or you might do on a phone call. And so thinking about where the language is using and what context is being used and what's being discussed. And that's something to consider too. And you're going to have that different at every level. Next, thinking about the text type. Again, we're not necessarily texting, but at the novice level, you're going to be super simple. You're not going to be maybe reciting sonnets, but perhaps you're going to be talking in simple sentences. Again, more about your personal things, your name, your likes and dislikes. Maybe you'll do some broader interaction than that, but that's what a lot of people do. By the intermediate stage, you can probably follow directions you can give someone directions. I put a paper airplane because one of the things I have students do is give students directions to do different things. I had them build Legos and give each other directions in Latin, which was super fun. If you have Legos, I would try it. And it's something that gets them going, gets them talking to each other, but it's also a way being able to speak and give clear directions is important, but simple, but something an intermediate learner could probably do. At the more advanced level, you can have more of those in-depth conversations. You can speak and be confident at another level. And again, there's two different types of speaking. As we know, we have interpersonal, which is again that extemporaneous speaking, or speaking at the same time. And then we have presentational speaking. And again, presentational speaking, unlike interpersonal, is rehearsed. That is something that is either live or recorded, but it's something that they've worked on, that they've rehearsed. It's something where they had context for it previously. Okay. Does that make sense for speaking? Isn't that so much clearer? Oh, interesting. I'm not sure how speaking can be culturally accurate. Can you give an example? Okay. That's a great question. So let's say you're at a certain let's say certain words are used for different things in different countries. That could be an example of being culturally accurate. Or so if you're talking about something in a certain context and one word is used versus another, making sure you're using the appropriate word for that context. Did that help at all?
May I also add something to that?
Yeah, please.
I'm a Spanish teacher, and we do a lot of idiomatic expressions.
Yeah.
For example, we've been learning about the subjunctive, and that's also a context, because they have, if you hear a word like ojalá, then you're going to use the subjunctive verbs, because that's a cultural thing. It's something that you do in Spanish countries, right? When you speak Spanish. So that's also another cultural context. And I think a lot of what you're saying that it's ringing true to me is that all of this is really facilitating the authentic learning of a student. Yes.
Absolutely. And I think it's just making it so much clearer. Thank you. That's a fantastic point. I think these standards just make things more understandable and really accessible in a way that's fantastic. That's why that was the first thing I said about it. This is accessible. These are things that we can understand easily. And I really appreciate that. Next, we're going to talk about writing. And so when you're writing, for example, at the novice level, the function of writing is simple. It has to be by its very nature, because you need a lot of input to be able to make the output for writing. So you only have so much input to work with. So you're going to have simple words, simple phrases, simple sentences at that novice level. For intermediate, you can have things like letter writing. I know letter writing varies from country to country, even in some languages. And so teaching, like saying, oh, okay, so you're writing a letter. Let's say we're doing pen pals or something, and this is how you would write a letter. This is a form. So learning different types of writing is something that can happen at that intermediate phase. Or even thinking about advanced, you can write or text back and forth. That's something that's really cool that you can do now with people all over the world. You can text back and forth or have them text with each other, which they also love to do. But again, that writing back and forth, it's not formal writing necessarily, but it's something that students can do with ease and confidence at that advanced level. Thinking about accuracy again, we have regular old accuracy, thinking about things like subject-verb agreement and all that good stuff. We also have vocabulary as a part of accuracy, making sure students are using vocabulary words that make sense within that context. And finally, writing accuracy takes into account, again, intercultural. Maybe you greet people different ways in different countries. Maybe you use different idiomatic expressions in your writing, depending on what country you're talking about and what language you're talking about. So there's an intercultural context to each of these accuracy. And I think that really well reflects the mosaic that is language learning, because you can't learn a language in a vacuum. We're talking about communication here. You can have all the grammar and all the vocabulary, and if you don't have the cultural context, you're really not communicating. And so that's why I think it's so important that that aspect is shared here and throughout this. And similarly, with writing content and context, you're going to do things very differently in your classroom, in a classroom setting, versus, let's say you had to fill out a form in the target language. Maybe you have, and that could be something you'd have to do. Or maybe you would have to look at a website in the target language. That's going to be, or write a website. Maybe you're writing a review for a restaurant in the target language. That's going to be, by its very nature, a different kind of writing perhaps than you're doing in the classroom. And finally, getting to that more advanced level, being able to email back and forth with people. Again, understanding what the context is and what the content is. And finally, thinking about the text type. So here for novice, I have a note, something short, something sweet. Even if you're doing journaling with students, you're not going to expect them necessarily to fill up pages and pages of text, again, because they just don't have the tools yet to be able to do that without sounding repetitive, perhaps. But by the time students get to that intermediate level, they have more tools in their toolbox, so they can do more of that writing. They can do more of that. And then finally, by the time they get to advanced, the text type can be things like chatting back and forth, because again, they've gained the confidence level to be able to write at that level. Because even though I think that it's really important, it's a super important skill to learn to do presentational writing. That is a really difficult skill, and that's a really cool skill. I think that one of the ways that you can really see an advanced learner is by the way they can interact back and forth with confidence, especially with things like writing and speaking. It's very cool to watch that growth over time. And so that's why I put that there. And again, here we're talking about writing as something that's interpersonal, that back and forth, but also presentational. And again, making sure that they can do it with or without visual support. Maybe you're doing a presentation, maybe you're doing a speech, it really depends. And doing writing as something that's more, again, focused, rehearsed, something that's familiar context, as opposed to just back and forth. Okay, any questions on writing? All right, we're going to go through listening now. And again, listening in some ways has changed. That first one, listening to stories, my students love Latin story time. We still do that. It's really great. Especially for novice learners, it's so fun for them to hear familiar stories in the target language. But we have students listening to music in the target language. We have students listening to podcasts in the target language, and students talking back and forth in the target language. These are all different functions and tasks of listening. I'm also going to add, which actual does not, but it's something that I kind of come up against a bit, is watching. Thinking about, like, when we watch a video in class, is that technically listening? I would say yes. I would say it's listening with visual aid. So you have visual aids for listening, but that would mean watching, because I know a lot of us use videos in our classroom. It's so easy and accessible to use videos, and there's so many great ones out there. But I think it's a really interesting thing to do for a listening task, because especially with those more novice learners, having the visuals of a video along with the listening can be very valuable. And I love closed captions. I think closed captions, especially for novice learners, but really throughout the time you're learning a language, can be extremely helpful, because you're using different parts of your brain at the same time. You're reading, you're listening, you're viewing, you have all these senses engaged, and that's a great way to have input. Again, thinking about accuracy. Not only is it accuracy so that you're listening to something and understanding something, but also you're listening to something and then you're internalizing it and can produce from that. So listening with the intent of getting that input to be able to eventually produce that output. Those are both really, really important. And for accuracy, thinking about things like you're listening. Are you understanding subject-verb agreement? Are you understanding vocabulary? Are you understanding grammar? And are you understanding the cultural context? If you're listening to a commercial in French, can you tell me what that commercial is about? That's something that has to do with listening accuracy. Can you tell me what it's about from the idiomatic expressions? Can you tell me what it's about given the words you know for things like that? Can you tell me if this is a weather report or a traffic report that you're listening to? These are all cultural contexts that are interesting that would appear for listening accuracy. And in that same vein, moving into content and context, things are going to be, you're going to listen to things differently in your classroom than you would necessarily listen to on a podcast or that you would necessarily watch. I know that I have some colleagues who teach Spanish, and a lot of the students love to watch shows in Spanish on YouTube and Netflix as a way to practice Spanish, to practice their listening skills, and just to engage more with the language, which is so cool. We need to get some of those for Latin. We only have a couple. And so it's really cool that the students are able to engage with that outside of class, but they understand that the content that they're watching perhaps on Netflix is a little different for maybe than the content they're going to be watching in class. Not necessarily, but perhaps. And so it's important for them to know the content that they're listening to and the context in which they're listening to it. And there are different text types. And when we're talking about, again, text types, we're not necessarily talking about text as in a book. We're talking about what are different types of listening students could be doing. And we've already talked about this. They could be listening to music. They could be watching a video. They could be doing a commercial. They could be listening to a podcast, or they could be just listening to someone speaking. So there's a lot of different content, text types that they can be doing when they're doing listening exercises. And again, two different types of listening. We've got the interpersonal, which is that listening with the intent to respond back and forth, understanding extemporaneous communication. And we also have interpretive. You're listening. It's that one-way conversation, that one arrow where you're listening and you're understanding and then demonstrating your understanding somehow. Okay. So again, I love these tables. They make so much sense. It's wonderful. And finally, reading. Now, reading at the most novice level they can do things like surveys. They can do things that are short or sweet, or things that are easy, simple reading. And then that moves into things like articles or maybe simple stories as they move from novice and intermediate. And finally, perhaps the most difficult of all is reading extemporaneously back and forth with something like reading a text or reading a more difficult or challenging academic text, or even doing some sort of discussion that's not extemporaneous. Maybe you have students doing an asynchronous where they have to talk about things and give evidence and make it more academic discussion back and forth. So there's a lot of different ways that students can be involved in reading. And even though we all love books, or at least I do, it doesn't always have to be reading a book in the target language. And certainly it doesn't have to be reading a textbook in the target language. There are many different ways to engage with reading. Again, reading accuracy. Of course, when students are reading, we are hopeful that they are absorbing the vocabulary, they're understanding the grammar and context and all of that. And we're hoping also that they're understanding the cultural context of what they're reading. They understand the background, they understand the history, they understand why the story is compelling and meaningful for them. And finally, we want them to understand what the story says. Sometimes we'll have students read things and maybe they don't quite understand. And that's why it's so important to make sure that when we're giving students text to read, text at any sort of reading, that it's something that they can understand. It's something comprehensible to them. So that's pretty important. And so that light bulb, that sense of understanding is also important for accuracy. And again, we have different content and context. Students could be reading by themselves in a library. That's a very different kind of content or context than if they're looking up things online. They might find different things when they're online. And finally, that's a different content and context than if they're reading someone's text with the intent to respond. Those are all different types of reading that students can engage with. And it's kind of, I see it almost as when I'm doing these, thinking like, my novice levels can read, my intermediates might be able to find more things on the web. And finally, the back and forth is something that my intermediates, but certainly my advanced students might be more confident with. And as we talked about before with each of these text types, so thinking, okay, newspaper articles or a book or an email or a discussion with a friend in the target language. Those are all different text types, but they all are things that people can be reading. So although they're different text types, They are all meaningful, and it's important to do different text types if you can. And I think one of the things that I appreciate about ACTFL bringing up different text types is making sure our students have a range of text types, that we're not just doing one text type, that we're doing lots of different things with these modes of communication. And again, with reading, you have interpersonal reading and texting. Again, that two-way communication back and forth. But you also have interpretive reading, where hopefully students are reading, understanding, and retaining what they have read. Oh my gosh, I made it right to 45 minutes. Woo! Okay. So there we are for any questions or comments. Oh, Amy has a comment. I've learned to focus the assessment on the meaning rather than on accuracy. Native speakers often do not communicate with perfect linguistic accuracy. Achieving accuracy is a long learning process. Yes, I completely agree. And I think that one of the reasons why the new ACTFL standards talks about different types of accuracy, for example, cultural accuracy, vocabulary accuracy. I think there's many different types of accuracy. And again, you can talk and speak in a language perfectly well, but perhaps if you don't know the cultural context, then there's going to be misunderstanding. So completely perfect speaking does not necessarily mean accurate. And I think that's something that's important. So thinking about the different aspects that go into making accurate speaking, reading, writing, and listening is really important. That's a great point. Other questions or comments? Did this help summarize it a little bit? Has anyone else read through it?
No, not yet.
Okay. Well, that's basically what a lot of it says. There's also a lot more breakdowns for each level. So for each level, you've got the novice, intermediate, and advanced, also distinguished superior for each of those different tasks. So you have all of those as well. But I think that I tried to summarize it in pictures as best I could, because I find those more engaging. Like I said, I'm a visual learner, so it helps me to summarize it. But I'm just so excited about these new standards because I love the accessibility. I love the fact that we can provide our students with a range of activities, a range of texts. And I love the fact that accuracy isn't just about speaking or writing accurately. It's about also understanding the context and making sure that accuracy is a bigger thing than just perfect grammar. So I love that. And I'm all about the grammar and context. So that just makes my heart happy.
Maureen, do you have the link of the new guidelines?
Oh, I can share that. Sure.
Thank you so much. I would like to read it.
Yeah, and it's really good. It's 56 pages long. So quite a bit long. Yeah, seriously. It's quite a bit longer than the 2012. 2012 was 22 pages. In case you can't tell, I did go back and forth between the two of them quite a bit when preparing this presentation. I wanted to see what the old language was and what the old examples were, as opposed to these examples. And in 12 years, it's amazing how much technology has changed. I was kind of trying to think back, like, oh gosh, what were things like in 2012? Because it was different. And I think that the idea of inclusive vocabulary and accessible vocabulary is really cool. Yeah, that's true, Heidi. The first 10 pages do provide a nice summary. And I think that if you're getting down into the nitty-gritty of the different levels, it's actually super helpful to have all of the levels laid out the way that they are. I really appreciate that. Other questions?
What's the difference between this guideline and the can do statement?
Okay, so the can do statements are what students can do with the language. These are to guide our instruction. These standards are more for teachers, for districts, for supervisors to talk about what we're doing with the language in the classroom. The can do statements are telling us what can the students do with the language. Now, when they were creating these standards, they did reference the intercultural competency standards and the can do statements throughout in different ways, but they all should align, if that makes sense. So there are obviously some of the language has changed. Like, love the idea that it's rote as opposed to memorized language. But at the same time, the can-do statements shouldn't be inaccurate. These are still the things we want students to do, but the actual standards are more, what are our standards for language learning within the context of our classrooms, within the context of our departments, and within the context of our districts. Does that make sense? Okay. The can-do statements aren't going away. The can-do statements are staying around.
Good.
Yeah.
I like can-do statement.
I do too. I think
I
they're
think
great. But I think they serve a different purpose than the 2024 standards.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Are they going to be updating? I heard that they are, but I'm not sure about this. The World Readiness Standards book then?
I don't know. That's a great question. I imagine that would be a massive undertaking. They
So
did
this
change.
still aligns with that in this sense.
Yeah, it does. They did change the cone slightly.
Mhm.
So they have a picture of the cone. Do you know what I'm talking about? The cone of language learning. Everyone's looking at me like, "What is Maureen doing?"
Yeah, it's in
No,
the summary.
there's the code of language learning. It is in the 2024 standards. It's just slightly different. It wouldn't surprise me, honestly, if they went in and thank you so much, Shamila. The proficiency pyramid, not the cone. Thank you. Here, y'all like, sorry, proficiency.
It does totally look like an upside down ice cream cone, or not
Okay,
an upside down. It looks like
exactly.
an ice cream cone. Yes, I've heard lots of people talk about it like that.
Elisa, thank you, because I don't know if it's the 80-degree heat or I just want an ice cream cone. Like that's what it looks like to me. But yes, the proficiency pyramid.
Yes.
Right. And so it does look slightly different. And I imagine that they would be doing that, but I do not have any inside information. Because that would be a huge undertaking because they'd have to go in and change all those languages. Other questions? Is anyone else as excited as I am for these? I think they're really fun. I wish I had had something like this when I was a new teacher. I think it would have been so helpful to have clear guidelines and clear language to help guide me as I started to teach. I think that's one of the great advantages of this. I think it'll really help new teachers that may need a refresher on these things. I think that it's really great for that. I was impressed with how it came out. Okay. Well, feel free to hang out if you'd like to ask individual questions, but just for fun, I want to let you know my contact information, because if you have questions about this or, AI, because I love AI too. Mizu chatbots are amazing. By the way, I did one for my final. Oh my gosh, it's so cool. But feel free to reach out if you're in Connecticut, come by and say hi. I'm latintech.tools@gmail.com. I'm at Latin Tech Tools on Twitter, Latin Tech Tools on Instagram, LinkedIn. And again, here is the tiny URL link and the QR code. And thank you so much for being here tonight at Idioma Education and Consulting. Again, we're hosting this, so feel free to reach out with any questions. If you want to hang out and ask any other questions, please let me know. Happy to answer them.
Thank you. This is very insightful. I appreciate
Thanks so much for coming.
Maureen, do you want to talk about your courses this summer?
Oh, sure. I'm teaching courses this summer. I have to look up which ones, but I am teaching courses this summer, and they're really fun.
Differentiation?
Oh, yes, the differentiation course. That is probably my favorite course to teach. It's been so much fun, and it's been a journey for me as someone who really wants to help people who have neurodiversity. And I think differentiation is a way we can reach all students. That's really important. And it's something that I'm incredibly passionate about, is making sure that my classroom is an inclusive and accessible place for all students. So differentiation is a course that's been a long time in the making, and it's something that I really enjoy. Yes, online courses. They are 6-week courses with work due every week, but the work you can do asynchronously and then turn it in on Thursdays and Sundays, which is really nice. And I also love that you get to be with other teachers, and I also join in the conversations because that's so fun for me. I really enjoy seeing what people have to say and responding and trying to figure out new ways of doing things. I think that that's what a lot of these courses are ways to get to know other teachers, but also to problem solve things we're doing in our own classroom. One of the wonderful things about Idioma is that our courses are by teachers for teachers. So they're completely about what you could do for your classroom. A lot of, I would say, like the vast majority of our assignments are things you can apply to your classroom right away. That's something that people who have taken my classes have said. They're like, oh yeah, we're doing it but then we get to use it in class. It's great. So it's not something that's going to give you something like a lot of busy work or anything. It's going to give you materials you can use in your class, which is fantastic. So highly recommend.
And designed for world language teachers specifically too, which is the best part. We don't get a whole lot of PD directed at us as world language teachers. So all of the coursework is, like Maureen said, what you'll be doing right away in your courses. I linked your other one, your social justice and the Latin curriculum also. So if you have Latin teachers out there, Maureen's social justice for Latin curriculum is amazing. It's a really great course.
Feel free to send it to your Latin teacher friends.
If anybody has any questions about Idioma, also about coursework, about credits, we partner with 4 different universities to be able to offer our courses for graduate level credit or for professional development in your state. I'm happy to answer any of those questions also.
It's also just amazing organization. Like I said, by teachers for teachers. I've been working with them for many years. Elisa and Melissa are amazing humans, and what they do and they really get some of the best teachers. The courses are so fun.
Thanks, Maureen.
It's so true. I learned so much.
Elisa, if I want to share this presentation with my coworkers, how can I get this video?
Yeah, I'm gonna tomorrow actually I'll do all the fun editing stuff and I'll post it on our YouTube channel and I'll send everybody a link through your email. So having registered for I'll put it up on all of our social media channels and everything also, but you guys will get the direct link in your email for having registered for the webinar ahead of time.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for sharing it. All of our other webinars are up there too. You can see Maureen and I have presented together in the past. Those webinars are up there. All of Maureen's webinars that she's presented with us are up there too. So if you want to go see some really great tech tool ideas, when we were during COVID, actually, we collabed on a whole bunch of different videos. So those are all on our YouTube channel.
Okay.
And hopefully AI soon.
Yeah. Yes, I was going to say I want to know more about what you just mentioned a minute ago. So we're going to put a webinar together for that too.
Yeah, for my Latin 1 students, I had them do a Mizu chatbot in Latin and it talks to them in Latin. It's so cool.
Oh, wow.
And it has not only speaking, but listening. So you can have them pronounce it for them. It was so cool. And it did automatic grading and gave you feedback. And I was like, whoa, this is so cool.
Yeah.
And I didn't let it automatically grade. I actually went in and physically graded everything. But having that is what you could do is really cool. It's getting so much better too, which I love.
Okay.
Great.
I have a follow-up question kind of based on, I think it was Amy's earlier question. So the can-do statements are obviously not the same thing, but there's things called proficiency benchmarks, and those are can-do statements, yes?
They can be.
I'm getting lost in word salad sometimes.
Right. There's so many different documents that have so many different purposes for ACTFL. I think it can be hard sometimes to see the forest through the trees.
Yes.
And so I would say the can-do statements are supposed to be what students can do. The 2024 proficiency, the 2024 standards are supposed to be what we're doing in our world language classrooms, what we can show kind of in the external document, again, to departments, to
the proficiency guidelines, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when we're thinking about what's student facing versus what's sort of teacher facing, the can-do statements are what I would share with my students at the beginning of a lesson, for example.
Yep.
And those are oftentimes worded from a proficiency target benchmark perspective. So I might say for a class that has a novice high target benchmark, I might say I can if it's an interpretive activity, I can understand the main idea and some supporting details about this text.
I'm thinking of like curriculum planning, what happens when you're trying to do big picture, but then you also have to bring it down to what the students can do. Like,
Sure.
there's just a lot of documents out there.
Yeah.
Exactly what Elise is saying. The can-do statements are more student-facing. So if you're trying to get students to understand what are the expectations for a lesson, that's when you'd use the can-do statements. And the can-do statements were not exhaustive on purpose, because the can-do statements, frankly, don't really apply very well to me teaching Latin. But I can use the can-do statements, and that they're meant to be something you can they're like a jumping off point. So you're not meant to necessarily repeat the exact same language of those can-do statements in what skills you want students to demonstrate, because they didn't do it exhaustively for every situation. So I think that it's pretty fair to say that you can take what you're doing in your curriculum and then kind of tailor the can-do statements to work with what you're doing there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm just trying to decide like how to approach explaining that to administrators, which documents
Yeah.
they should be looking at.
Heidi, do you have a unit planning template that you use in Connecticut already?
I think every district's different.
Every district. Okay. So if you have one that's mandated by the district and you want us to take a look at that, we can help figure out where do we put the can-do statements in that unit planning template versus where do we put.
Oh, no, I mean, I've done plenty of this. I'm just wondering like what the new proficiency guidelines change in this landscape, because there's a lot of documents out there now.
Sure. And I think that the idea behind this is less of it being a change and more of it being an update with more inclusive language. I think that was the goal behind it. It wasn't we're redoing whatever communication is. It's more of we're trying to make this easier to understand, and we're trying to make this clearer and in a way that is more inclusive language. Because previously they had words that they didn't feel were as inclusive or as helpful to people, and they wanted to make it so that it was laid out in a way that was simple and precise, and so that everyone could read it and everyone could understand it. So I think that was one of the big motives.
And every state is coming out with their own documents, so you have to answer.
Connecticut one, yes.
Yeah.
Fortunately, they all are based on these ACTFL guidelines. So while the state documents might look different, in my experience with digging through those and us putting out professional development to be able to help teachers and districts sort through them, they all just are very similar language in a different format.
Sometimes they try to condense it or.
Right. And I think a lot of the states have to make it line up to other subject areas. And I think it's almost like they're taking a lot from those ACTFL documents and then they are making it line up with whatever the state template is. So it's really interesting. It's like, it's a little bit, it's different than everyone might expect, because when you really dig it down to the heart of it, just like Elise is saying, you're going to get most of the language is going to be very similar to the things put out by ACTFL.
Yes.
And if anyone's interested in digging into that work as a department, we would be more than happy to come in. This year, especially in Massachusetts, we were working with several districts to help navigate how the guidelines fit into the DESE. For Massachusetts, we have the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education template. And then each district sometimes has a different template also. So how do we make all these things work together, and how do we report out correctly to NEASC, and how do we do all that? We help with that work. So if you're looking for some guidance there, feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Sounds good. Multiple repeated exposures, always good. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all so much for taking the time to be here. We know your school year is still going on, and you've got class first thing tomorrow morning. So thanks for taking the time tonight.
Yeah. Nice seeing you. Nice meeting you. Bye.
Yes.
Bye. Thank you.
Have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye.